So the image, and I'm gonna call it the home image, very simple. Okay, so source, it's in the image folder, and home, or actually it's house, I believe. So house1.jpg, and let's just call it house number 1. Next up, we have the heart icon, and let's actually copy the syntax here for the SVG, because it's rather difficult to write it all out. And so this one is called home like, and the name of the icon is heart full. And so that is the like icon. Next up, we have the name of the home, and for that I'm going to use an H5 element, but this time not a reusable one, because we want this one only to be in here. And so this is called the home name, and it's a beautiful family house. Next up, we have these 4 details about the property, so the location, rooms, area, and price. And so each of these will be one element, so a div called home location. And then in here we will have an icon and a paragraph for the text. Okay, so this one is called the map pin. And then for the text, let's just say it's in the USA. And I'm actually not going to give these ones here a class name, because I would have to call this like home location icon and then home location text or something. And I don't think that's necessary. So let's just keep it here at home location. And then we know that we can style the SVG in there and the P element in there separately. Okay, so let's check that out at this point. And so of course the image here is huge. And all of this looks rather strange, but yeah, that's because we didn't format anything at all. So this will actually be quite similar for the other ones. So I'm just going to copy this a couple of times. And so the first one was location, then the second one is the rooms. Then this one will be area, and the last one is the price. So for the rooms, we have this icon called profile mail, saying 5 rooms. Then we have icon expand here for the area, and 325 square meters. So let's now use the sub element here. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this one, but basically what it does is that it moves the text a bit up. And so in this case, because we have square meters, so the 2 should be a bit on top of the 2, of the M actually. So just like this, so square meters. Maybe in the US you're going to use square feet or something like that, I'm not really sure. But here in Europe we use, of course, square meters. Then for the price, we have the key icon, and let's say that this one costs $1.2 million. So quite an expensive home. But again, we're talking about luxury homes here, and so that's reasonable. Okay, looks good to me. Now all that's left is the button. So button, and now we're going to reuse the one that we created before, which is called simply CTA. And contact Realtor. Okay, and that's it. And let's now just confirm if everything is okay. And it is. Okay, and so we're now ready to do the same thing here for all the other 5 homes. And if you find it a bit boring to watch me creating this HTML structure here, then you can just use the final code and skip this part until the end of the video, okay? And so then you don't have to waste time doing all of this. But anyway, I will do it here now in the video. And so if you want to join me doing that, then of course you're more than welcome. So let's get rid of this. And 3, 4, 5, and 6. So that is a lot of code here. And where does it even start? Okay, so this is the first one. This is the second one. So this is simply house number 2. It is called the Modern Glass Villa. So Modern glass villa. And if you're wondering how I selected all of this text here at the same time, I simply used this shortcut here for expand selection. Okay, so on your computer maybe this is a different shortcut, but I used this one here. Okay, so basically with that we can select all of the text that is inside of two tags like this one here. Okay, so we have Canada here, 6 rooms, 450 square meters, and 2,750,000. Okay, so next one. It's a cozy country house. It's in the UK. It has 4 rooms, 250 square meters, and it costs only 850,000. I think I forgot the image here. Yeah, that's right. So 2. This one is number 3. Or actually this one should be number 4 already. So number 2. Yeah, that's number 3 here. And so this one is the large rustical villa. Located in Portugal with 6 rooms, 480 and 1.950 millions. Number 5. It's a majestic palace house in Germany with a mind-blowing 18 rooms and 4,230 square meters. So of course I came up with all of this here arbitrarily, so none of this is real at all. So if you're a realtor by chance and none of this makes any sense to you, then I'm sorry for that. I just wanted to come up with some project here, and so I made up all of these numbers. So a modern family apartment. This one is in Italy with only 3 rooms, 180 and 600,000. Okay, and so that's it. So that's our content in the HTML. It looks all kind of weird now, and that's because these images are way too big, such as the icons. So let's just very quickly fix that, so in order that it doesn't look that bad. So let's close this one here and this one. And so let's here now add the selectors for the image. And let's say with 100%. And so that should make it better. Then we can also add all the other selectors here. So the one for like, for the name, and then the ones for the location, rooms, area, and price, they will actually be like all the same. Okay, and so let's add them all into one bigger selector. So location, the rooms, the area, and the price. And then remember that in there we have the SVG and the P, right? So in each of them we have the icon and then the P element. Okay, so let's add that as well. So of course as a nested element here, because it's inside of these selectors, and the same for the P. And so let's also now style these SVGs, because these icons, they are way too big now. Okay, so first we can also fill them, so change their color basically. And again, I'm going to use color primary. and then a height and a width of 2 rem. And again, the height and the width here being the exact same value. Okay, and so just like this looks a bit more friendly now. So that is the first part of building this section and these home cards. In the next video, we're then going to take care of actually building the card and laying out all of these elements. So if you're ready for that, then let's move on together. So after a quick break, let's now continue building the home section that we were working on. So I already mentioned that we were going to lay out all of these elements in the card using a grid. But how are we actually going to do that? And the first thing that comes into my attention here is that this actually is laid out like in 2 columns, right? So you see that here we have these 2 on the left side and these 2 parts here on the right side. And so what that means is that we have a grid which has 2 columns here. And so we can then put basically these 2 here on one side in one column and these 2 in another column. And all the other elements, just like this button here, this name and this image, they can then span both these columns from one side to the other side of the grid container. And so let's now quickly do that and create our 2 columns. And as for the rows, we can actually let CSS take care of that automatically. Okay, so we're just going to define the columns and then the rows will be put automatically in there. And so once more, we're using an implicit grid here actually. And so you're probably starting to see that this is kind of a pattern. So most of the time, we just define the columns and then let CSS figure out the rows automatically. Now that's not always the pattern, so that's not always how it's going to work, but many times that is the best practice. Okay, so very simple in this case. Grid template columns, and all we want is 2 columns with the same size. So repeat 2, 1 fr. All right. Then before that's going to work, of course, we need to add display grid. And so now we're ready to see how that's going to look like. And all right, it's actually already doing what it's supposed to do. So let's now say that we want this image, this name here, and a button to span across both the column tracks. Okay, and that shouldn't be all too hard. All we have to say is grid column from 1 to -1. Right? And I'm actually going to copy this one here because it also applies to the name and to the button. Now, how are we going to do this with the button? Well, we should actually add a class here, I guess. So beside that class that it has here already, let's call it the home button as well. So home button. And so let's add that down here as well. And grid call from 1 to -1. Okay, and actually I noticed that I called this CTA for some reason, and CTA means call to action, but I think that up here I called it something else. And yeah, I called it button actually. Okay, so let's go to all of these. So I select CTA now, and then I hit Command D here in VS Code to select all of them. And then I just have to paste, and it's going to paste it in all of these 6 places. Okay, and if I check it out now, yeah, then that looks much better. So the image is already spanning here across the entire container, but for some reason the button is not. So let's check out why. And yeah, I guess I know why, because I only added this here to the last one. So of course I need to add this class to all of them. Okay. And just one more left. And yeah. Okay, so that's much better. So let's take a look at our grid here actually in the DevTools. So this one here. All right. And where is it actually down here? Well, let's inspect it. And yeah, so you see that it's spanning these 2 grid columns. Then we have this like icon here, which we still have to format. Then we have the name, and such as we specified, it's spanning these two columns as well. And then all of these 4 details here, they are of course just one cell, each of them. Okay, so let's now style this heart and position it up here in the corner. And so how do you think we should do that? And I think that the best way here is to use overlapping. So basically placing this grid item here on top of this image. So in this grid cell here. So right in this grid cell. Okay, so that's where I'm going to place this heart icon. So from column 2 to 3 and from row 2 to 1. Homes and yeah, here we go. So grid row, and now I have to specify all of this because otherwise the auto placement algorithm is just going to put it in column 2, 3, but not in the first row where I want it to be. So from grid line 2 to grid line number 3, just as we said before. Now let's also do the same as down here, but make it just a bit bigger. All right, if we take a look at that now, then here we go. So this is exactly where we wanted it to be. The problem is that now the image actually moved down. And that's because the automatic placement algorithm doesn't automatically put grid items one on top of another. So instead it just moves this one here down. But we don't want that to happen. We want this also to be in the first row. And so we have to specify that just as we had to do for the icon. So where is that? Yeah. So grid row from 1 to 2, please. And that should fix it. Now, just to be sure that this icon here will always stay on top of this image, let's just give each of them a z-index. And so this one, of course, will be higher. So a z-index of, let's say, 1, and the like a z-index of 2. Okay, and it worked even without that, but just to be 100% sure, and also to show you that this is how we define which of the elements should be placed on top of the other. Now, just one more thing here with the like is this here, so it's not aligned here to the right side as we want it to be. And how do we align grid items inside of grid cells horizontally? We just use the justify items property, right? But in this case, we want this to happen only with this one here. And so we can use justify self on this exact item. So justify self is going to align the item inside the grid cell, and we want it to be all the way to the end. So here we go. Now it's here all the way to the end. Now just one more thing. Let's just give it some margin here. So to push it down and right a little bit. So margin 1 rem, and with that we should be good to go. All right, so that looks much better. Next up we have this name of the house. And so that is how this looks like. So how are we going to do that? Well, first up, let's style this element and take care of placing it afterwards. So we're talking about this one here, the name. And so let's start with the font family. And this one is the display font. And so I'm using that variable name here. The font size is 1.6 rem. I want the text to be aligned at the center. It should have some padding of 1.25 rem. And the background color of color secondary. So that's or a dark blue. Then the color itself is white. And the font weight 400. So I'm doing all of this very quick and very fast without explaining much because you're already familiar with all of this, and that's not really part of the CSS grid anyway. Okay, so that's the main style, and so let's now think about the more difficult stuff. Well, for some reason nothing really happened. Let's see why that is. And it's probably because of this error here. So let's give it a save again, and then yeah, here we go. So how do we now go from looking like this to what we have here? So basically, the width of this item here is not 100%, but just 80%, then all of this here is centered in the grid cell, and then it's also moved up a bit. Okay, so let's take care of the first things that I said. So first off, the width is only 80%. And then it is horizontally aligned inside of its grid cell. And that's pretty easy. So once again, we're going to use justify self. And this time, set to center. So that's really easy, right? So that's how it looks like right now. And now all we have to do is to place it here, kind of here in the middle. Okay, and we have two options for that. The first one is to move it up from here, but then that would create like this half empty row here, right? So basically we would have one row which would be half empty, and then half of it would be occupied by this element. And I don't think that's really perfect. And so instead, what I'm going to do is to place this grid item here right in this first row. So basically putting it here into this first row. So here on top of the image. So using overlapping once again. All right. So I already defined the grid column. Let's also define the grid row. 1, 2. And let's define a z index as well, in order to ensure that it's going to be on top of the image. So how does that look like? And whoa, it's stretching all the way from the top to the bottom of this grid cell. But that's of course not what we want. And so we have to vertically align it here to the bottom. And so we already used justify self. And for this one, we're going to use align self. And to the bottom, right? So justify self and align self are pretty similar, with the difference that justify does it horizontally, and so in the row axis, and align does it vertically, and therefore in the column axis. Okay, and so that should fix that, and for some reason it didn't, and that's because it's not called bottom, but it's called end instead. Okay, so let's take a look at that in the DevTools, and alright, so here it is, all the way to the end of this grid area. And now it's just very simple, we just have to move it down with a simple translate. So transform, translate in the y direction 50%, because 50% corresponds to 50% of the height of the element itself. And so it's going to place it exactly at the center. And here we go. So that is the result that we were looking for. So I hope that you understood the reasoning about it, so why I did it the way that I did. And I thought this was a cool way of showing you why some of these properties like justify self or align self are really important to know all the time and have always in mind whatever situation we face when we build our layouts. Now, of course, we need some more space here. So this is now actually overlapping this icons here and this row, of course. And so let's just create some space between the rows. Okay, and that is actually pretty easy. We just need the grid row gap. So where is that? Gap. And I'm going to go with 35 pixels here. So again, this was here obtained through experimentation, and I settled here on this value. So I thought this was the best. Now this still looks rather strange. So you see that the space here between this home name and then this row here is not quite as we want it to be, right? And that's because we moved this here down, and so we created this inequality here, right? So let's see that a bit better here. Yeah, so you see that we have actually these 3.5 rems here, here, and here, but then we have like this overlapping. And it would be amazing if CSS Grid allowed us to style some of these gaps individually. So what I would like to do now is to say that this first gap here should be like 5 or 6 rem, and the others should only be 3.5 rem. But unfortunately, that's just not possible with CSS Grid at this point. And I don't know if that's going to change in the future, but right now, when we specify the gap in the grid, it will be the same for all the rows and for all the columns. So we cannot style just one gap individually. And so we just have to come up with a solution for that. And the solution that I found is to add a small margin to the top of these two items. So the house location and the house rooms. So if we add a margin to the top of these two, then that will increase basically the space between this name and then this next row. So that is again not ideal, it's not perfect, but we have to come up with solutions like this from time to time. And in fact, it works perfectly fine in this situation, doing it like this. Okay, so let's copy this from here. And add a margin top of 2.5 rem. And if we check that out now, then that actually looks a lot better. And you can see it even better here over here. And yeah, so that's the best solution that I could come up with at this point. Another solution would have been to say that the second row here should be a bit higher than the others, and then move these two here down to the bottom of this row. But I think this way it's actually better. It's a bit cleaner. Okay, so not interfering with the individual height of these grid rows. Okay, and so we're now actually almost done with this grid. All we have to do is to apply some simple styles here to each of these four characteristics of the homes. So let's do that, and let's set the font size at first. And actually we can do it right here. So font size 1.5 rem, and then the text is going to inherit it, and so I don't even need this selector here. Next up, I want to give each of these four details a margin to the left side of 20 pixels, so 2 rem, and so that's how it's going to look like then. And so all that's left to do now is to actually put these two elements here side by side. And what's the best tool for that job? Well, I strongly believe that Flexbox is the way to go here. So Flexbox is really perfect for this really small stuff. And even if we start using CSS Grid for almost everything one day, I think that for this small alignment stuff, Flexbox is always going to be the easiest and most straightforward solution, because it's really as simple as that. All we have to do is to really say display flex, and then they will be two side by side. Okay, and even better, what we can do is to say align items and center. And so we will also vertically center these two items along the cross axis, right? So basically vertically. And so that looks even better now. And all of that with just two very simple lines of code. Now here on the icon, let's give it some margin to the right side. So in order to separate the icon from the text, so margin right 1 rem. And that's necessary because in Flexbox, there's not something like the grid gap that we have in CSS Grid. So in Flexbox, we cannot specify gaps like we can with grids. But actually, I read somewhere, I think on Twitter, that they are thinking about adding gaps to Flexbox as well. And so someday if that becomes available, then that will be fantastic. So we'll no longer have to deal with margin rights, then we could simply add like a gap here in the Flex container in order to separate the icon from the text here. Okay, but right now that's not available, but maybe someday in the future we will be able to do that. And so then it's even simpler. Okay, and I think that's actually it. I think that's the design we were going for. And yeah, I think it looks exactly the same, in fact. So that's awesome. That's great progress from you up until this point. We're building more and more complex layouts here, using more and more advanced techniques. And so we're already mixing CSS Grid with Flexbox and using some advanced placement techniques as well. So I hope that this is really useful for you so that you can build your own designs sometime in the future using all of these powerful techniques. It's now time for one of the most fun parts of this project, and that's building a gallery with CSS Grid. And so, yeah, that's exactly what you're going to learn in this lecture. So how to create a complex grid-looking gallery. So one that you can really see that it was built with an underlying grid. And for that, you're also going to learn how to use object fit together with images for grid items. And this is the gallery that I'm talking about. And from the beginning, I wanted to include something like this in this project, because it's really a perfect use case for CSS grids, because you can really see how these items, so how these images, were literally aligned to an underlying grid. So it's really visible, and so it's a perfect use case. And actually, it would have been maybe not impossible, but extremely difficult to do this without CSS grid. And so again, it's a perfect use case to show you once again how powerful CSS grids are. So how do we go about creating this grid structure? So we have to select the number of columns and the number of row tracks here, of course. And so how are we going to do that? It seems like a rather complex task, right? So a couple of things about that. Well, the most important thing to consider is the smallest unit that you want to have in your grid. So in this case, that would be this cell here, so like this image. So I have to create a grid with as many columns as necessary to create a small image here like this. So one of the columns is the size of this image, because it's the smallest unit here. And the same, of course, applies to the row. So you see that the height of one row is the height of this unit here. And this height is actually visible here anywhere over the place. So the height of this unit here is also like, for example, this one here. And so that's going to allow us to place items like this using, of course, some spanning, so that it really looks like this huge grid here in the end, with all of these items aligned like this, with some images bigger than the others, like this one and this one, then some smaller ones, and coming in all different shapes. So this one here is in portrait, this here is maybe like a square, this is also here like a square, and this one, so they're similar to the one here. And yeah, so basically the more columns and the more rows you have, the more complex you can create these items here. The more variety in sizes and shapes you can create with the grid, okay? So let us actually take a look at the underlying grid that we have here. So let me select it here from the list, and it's this gallery, okay? So you see that we have 8 columns. So it goes from line number 1 to line number 9, and 7 rows, okay? And I did this through some experimentation, of course, which means that you never come up with this right from the beginning. So maybe I started with 10 columns and 10 rows, and then at some point I noticed that 10 was a bit too much, and then I did an 8x8 grid, and then I noticed that I don't even need the 8th row, and so I just cut it to 7 rows. And so in the end, I ended up with this 8x7 grid. And you see again that this is here is the smallest unit, and you see this grid cell, for example, over here on this side. And so basically each of these areas that you see here are made up of a couple of these grid cells. So for example, here we have 2 and 2, and here we have 4, and here we have 9 in this image. Here we have like 6, okay? And so again, the more grid cells we have, the more complex and the more variety we can have in these images, okay? So let's set up that underlying grid here in CSS. And of course we need some grid item. So let's start with having just one image so that I can show you how I implemented all of this. Okay, so down here we should have the gallery, and yeah. So I'm going to use an image here and call it gallery img, and this one is going to be called image and then gal1, okay, and gallery image1. And actually we're going to change this here later, but more on that a bit later. Okay, so we can close our homes now and open the gallery file, which is this one. So let's get rid here of this background color, set display to grid, and then add our rows and columns. So grid template columns, and as I mentioned, I made 8 columns, and all with the same size, of course, occupying the entire grid container. And then the rows. So template rows. And remember I said that I have 7. And now what about the height of each of them? So let me show that to you. So what happens when I resize this here? So you see that each of these cells here actually maintains its aspect ratio perfectly fine, right? And so what that means is that the height of these rows is somehow tied to the viewport width, right? And the easiest way to do that is to simply use the viewport width unit, okay? And so that's exactly what I did. And so we have 7 columns, each one with the height of 5 viewport width. And so again, I experimented with these heights, and I came to the conclusion that 5% of the viewport width is the perfect size for the height. Now we of course could have done this in a different way, and that is to basically preset the height of this row. So I mean of this entire row. So basically preset the height of the row that contains this gallery container, and then we could have used the FR unit here as well. And so that would have then divided equally the height of the container by the number of rows. Okay, I hope that doesn't sound too confusing, but I think it's actually a bit more straightforward to do it like this. So using the viewport width unit, and so then that will define the height of this gallery item here, which will then in turn define the height of the row of our overall layout. All right, so let's take a look at that. And so here we go. Maybe I shouldn't have removed the background color here. And actually, yeah, I shouldn't have, because this was actually the correct background color for this element. So let's get it back. And I think it was, yeah, I think it was this one. And yeah, okay. Now let's just quickly add another one. So gallery number 2. Just so that we see how they look like side by side. But I see that they're not really side by side. So let's actually check out what we have here. And now that's really weird. For some reason we have 2 columns and our grid container is way too big, so I'm not sure what's going on here. So like this page is really huge now. But I don't really have an idea why that is happening. So let's inspect element, and it tells me that the gallery is 2000 pixels wide now, which doesn't make much sense. So let's maybe add this page in Google Chrome to see if this is maybe a bug with Firefox. And so I'm just gonna copy here the address of our page and open Google Chrome, pasting it here. And we see that our site looks good here actually too in Google Chrome. And so that's good to know. And all right, so now I see what's going on here. And it's because these images are huge. Okay, so for some reason in Firefox it doesn't show up like this. The images are actually quite small. But this shows me why the grid container is so big right now. Okay, and so let's now go back to our code and fix that. So this is just a temporary fix. So let me simply say that I want all of the child elements to have a width of 100%. So that should fix it. And indeed, here we go. So that is much better. And now, well, actually there's still something going on here. I'm not sure what's that, but it's no problem. I'm sure that if I reload the page or something, then that's gonna disappear. Or if not, it's gonna disappear later at some point, I'm sure. Now remember the talk that we had earlier about images as grid items, right? So down here, so up here actually, we had the same thing. So we had images as grid items. And remember that these images, they have an intrinsic aspect ratio. And because of that, they don't really fill the grid cells that they are assigned to, right? So you see that this image here, it's not really filling up just one of these cells, but instead it really overflows it and stretches as much as it has to in order to keep its intrinsic aspect ratio. And the same, of course, with this one. Now this is going to create huge problems here for our gallery because these images actually don't have the same aspect ratio, and so therefore this will create a very messy looking gallery, not exactly like we want it to be. And if we add a gap here to our grid, then that's going to make it even worse. So let's actually do that. So a grid gap of 1.5 rem. And as you have noticed, this gap is always only between the columns and the rows, but not on the sides, so not around the grid. But in this case, we actually want some space around the grid container as well. And so let's just add some padding here. So a padding of 1.5 rem as well. And so that's going to look as if the gutter was also on the outside of the grid. So just like that. Okay, so again, we actually want this image to stop here. So in order to only occupy this cell that it was assigned to. I mean, we didn't actually manually assign it to this cell, but the grid auto placement algorithm just put this image here in this first cell and the second image into the second cell. But still, it's overflowing the cell, and that's not the behavior that we want. So how can we fix that? And what we're going to do is a small property that we've used before in another project called object fit. And object fit is perfect for this, because remember that if we set object fit to cover, it's like setting background size to cover for a background image. So basically having an image filling a container. Okay, and so what we're going to do here is to add a parent container for each of these elements, then put the element in there and add object fit to that parent element. Okay, does that make sense? So let me show that to you here in the HTML. And so let's use the figure element here now, which I'm going to call gallery item and gallery item number 1. Okay, and so this is a figure, so I have to put the name in here. And now this is where I'm going to put the image. So let's get rid of this one. And okay, so remember, gallery item is what it's called like. So let's just add that selector. And then for the image as well. And so we actually want the image to have the width of 100%. Right? So let's take a look at that now. And for now, of course, it's still the same. But now it's no longer the image that is the grid item, but the figure element. Okay? And so now let's then actually use the object fit property. And we have to do that here on the image element. So object fit set to cover. Now this is only going to work if you set both the width and the height. Okay? So I once tried making this work for half an hour and it didn't work, until I discovered that I have to manually set both the width and the height. So let's just set the height to 100% as well. And so with that, we're good to go. And actually, I'm also going to set the image to a block element. So display block, because otherwise it always has these weird small white space after it, because it's treated like an inline element, and so it's like it's text. Okay, and so that should fix it. And indeed, it does. And so now that part that was overlapping the figure element is now gone. Let's actually take a look at that. And so you see that the figure is right here in the grid cell, and then the image is in there. And it's now only the height of the parent element itself. And that's again because of the object fit property set to cover. Okay, so let's now actually position this item. So this is the number 1. So grid row from 1 and span 2. And this one the same. So now it's going to be bigger. Yep. And you see that it's only occupying the exact grid area that we defined. So just like we have it here. So it's now exactly the same, no longer causing the problems with the intrinsic aspect ratio that we had before. So the first image is now placed. We now know how this works and how we do all of this. So in the next video, we can then place all of the remaining images in order to make it look in the end just like this. So stay tuned and see you in a minute. So let's finish up the gallery that we were building. And I actually want to do this as a small challenge for you. So you already know how it's going to look like in the end. And so I'm sure that you're going to be able to place all the remaining 13 images here on the grid just like this, okay? So I'm sure you can do it. And so pause the video now, and I'm going to be back in a minute and show you how I did solve this. So, did you manage to do it? Let me now show you my solution, so my way of doing this. And first of all, I'm going to include all of the images in the markup. Okay. Now, instead of copying this here and then changing this number 1 here in the item, in the name, and the alt text, I'm going to use Emmet to actually do all of this in one line of code. Okay, so this is going to be the most complex Emmet code that we ever wrote. So let me show you how I did it. So we want a figure with the name gallery item. So nothing new up until this point. And also gallery item number, and then the automatic numbering here again, right? Then in there, we want an image called gallery image. And now we can also specify the attributes here. And that's using the square brackets, just like this. So we can say that the source should be image gal, and then the number, and then JPEG. And that works because the images that we use for this are named like this, like gallery 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, all the way to 14. Okay, and so that's why we can use this numbering here as well. So that's the source attribute, and then I can also specify the alt attribute. And so gallery image, and then the number. Okay, and so now that Emmet understands this really, let me put this here in parentheses, and then write 14 times. Hit tab, and bam, here we go. So we have now all of these 14 figures with the 14 images, all named from 1 to 14, such as the image names and the alt text. All right, so I can now get rid of this first part here, which is exactly the same as this one. So let's check it out here. And indeed, here we have our 14 different images. Now all we have to do is to place them on the grid just like this. And so let's actually use this one here as a reference. So again, in order to come up with this layout here, I had to go through kind of a lot of experimentation, but that would be way too much to do in a video like this. And so I'm just going to place them like they are here. And if you want to go through all that experimentation by yourself, then please feel free to do that. So you can, of course, try to position them in a completely different way and try to come up with your own gallery, right? But I'm just going to show you the way that I did this. So this one here is the second one, and we see that it starts on column number 1 and then spans across 3 tracks. And the same for lines. So from line 1, spanning across 3 tracks. So let's copy this. So grid row and span 3, and grid column starts on number 3, so line number 3, and spans across 3. And of course here number 2. And that's it. So next up, from 1 and spanning 2 rows and just 1 column. So number 3 from row 1 spanning 2 and then just 1 column. So just from column 1 to column number 3. Just to confirm, oh, something didn't go quite well. And yeah, of course, it starts at column 6 and goes to 7. So that's of course a mistake. But now that's fixed. So next one occupies then all the way until the end of the grid and across to 2 rows. So number 4, grid row and spans 2, and the columns, it starts at number 8 and until the end of the grid. Okay, and actually it starts at number 7. Okay, so grid line number 7, and of course, yeah, that was kind of obvious because this one here ended at line number 7, and so this one, of course, had to start at line number 7, right? So next one then here starts at line number 3 and goes all the way to line number 6. So it spans across 3 rows and spans across 2 columns, right? And so now you can actually see how useful it is to use these Firefox DevTools for grid, because without it we would have like a hard time, of course, visualizing this grid and then also keeping track of the line numbers, right? So it's really great by Mozilla that they did it like this. Okay, starts at grid row number 3 and spans across 3, and the columns, I think it's good like this. Yeah, so that looks good. Next one, we have this one here with the pool, and it starts at number 4, spanning 2 rows, and starts at column number 3, spanning 2 as well. Four and 3. Okay. Now maybe this may seem like a bit of a boring task to having to align all these items like this, and I kind of agree with that. But there's really no way around it. And of course, if you were to do this without the grid, then it would be 1,000 times worse. Okay, so I'm really thankful for having this method, and I'm not complaining at all. So then next one is this here, and it starts at row 4 and column 5. So 4 and 5. 4 and 5, and actually 4 and 5 here, and it's only one cell, and so that should work. Yeah. Next up, there's this one here, starting from row 3 and column 6. So 3 and 6. And number 8. Yep. The next one is this here, starting from row number 3 and column number 8. And it goes all the way across 3 tracks. So 3 row tracks. So row 3 and span across 3. And grid column 8 to -1. So the last one. So perfect again. And only 5 more to go. So the next one is this one here. So row number 6 spanning 2 row tracks. And of course column from number 1 to 2. Number 10 now. There you go. And now the next one, from row 6 to row 8 and column 2 to 4. So 6 and 2 spanning 2, I believe. And yeah, kind of. It's number 11 here, of course. Yeah, so that's better. And now we can already see how the next ones will be. So the next one is going to fill up this remaining space, and then this one will fill up this here, and then the last one will probably fill up this space here. So let's confirm that. And yeah, so this space here, then this one, and then this one. So the next one starts at row 6 and column 4. So let's copy that. And column 4. And yeah, it actually doesn't span the column. So just column number 5. All right, then the next one we don't have to actually see the solution. We already know that it's going to be here. So from row 5 and column 5, spanning across 3 tracks in each direction. So 5, 5, and spanning 3 tracks. Oh, and something's wrong there. Ah, right. And now just one to go. So this one is from row 6 and column number 8. Row 6, span 2, so that's correct. And column 8, 2 minus 1. Don't forget to change this. And that is it. All right. Awesome. So our images are nicely aligned here. Let's take a look at it without this grid overlay. And yeah, so that looks fantastic. And it's all thanks of the grid, of course, and of the object fit property. So let's actually take that one out. So just to see how it would look like without it. And also without the height property here. So that is how it would look like, right? So if we would just place the images on the grid and they would try to keep their intrinsic aspect ratios, then that's the result we would have ended up with. Okay, so that's a bit weird. If we then set the height to 100%, then we would keep our gaps here very nicely, but then the aspect ratio would be gone and we would have ended up with weird results like this one, where the image is very stretched, or here you can also see it very stretched, and also here. And so that's not what we want at all. And so object fit, see the difference now? So object fit is really what makes this possible, along with, of course, CSS Grid. So I hope you liked that, and see you in the next one. All right, let's now build the very simple footer of our page. And so in this section, you're actually not going to learn any new stuff, but you will apply all the concepts that we already learned to a new situation. And so that's also helpful to practice. So what we will do is just basically this very simple footer navigation here, and then this text down here. So something very simple. So this is where our footer is. And so let's use a nav element, and I'm also actually going to call it nav. So nav for navigation. Then in there, as always, we have a bunch of li elements. Nav item, and then in there we have a couple of links. So a dot nav link pointing to nowhere, and then the text in the first one is find your dream home. And so let's copy that and create a bunch more. So request proposal, download the home planner. So this is just a couple of link items that don't really matter. It's just some placeholder text here. So submit your property. And finally, come work with us. And so let's now style all of this. And the first thing that we want here is in a footer is some padding. Okay, so that we can actually see what's going on here. And then our navigation. Okay, and actually this should be not a nav element, but an UL. Okay, so if we have an li element, that one should always be inside a UL element. Okay, so now that we have the UL, we can then say that we want list style none. And so let's just take a look at that now. And here we go. Now, how do we put these items here side by side? We can use Flexbox and we can use Grid. Well, in this case, we have a one-dimensional layout, and so Flexbox would seem like the best choice. But actually, I will use SASS grid. And that's because I find it easier to work with grids when we want some space between the elements, right? So with Flexbox, we would have to use margin right, and then on the last element, we would have to say that we want no margin at all, okay? And with CSS grid, it's just more natural. We just have to define a grid gap, and it just happens like between the elements. And so until there's something like that in Flexbox, I find it easier to work in these situations with CSS grid. So let's define now a simple grid, and it's simply going to be 6 columns, right? And it's actually not actually here, but here in the nav, of course. So display, grid, and the template columns should be. And now let's think about this. So once more, we want this to be automatically responsive without writing the media queries, right? And so instead of just writing 6.1fr, with what get the job done, we can make it better. And so instead, we use our old trick where we use autofit here as the number of columns. And so that one will automatically figure out how many tracks there should be. And the size should always stay behind, let's say for now, 20 rem and 1 fr. And so as soon as one of these tracks gets narrower than 20 rem, one of the column tracks will disappear, right? So that's what we've always been doing. So let's now actually style these links so that we can then take a look at if that actually works, okay? So let's style a link. And of course the link state and the visited state. And that's not correct, of course. But that's it. So that's the way we've been always doing it. Select the link and the visited state here at the same time. So font size 1.4 rem. The color should be white. No text decoration in order to get rid of the underlining. And the font family should be our display font. I also want the text in uppercase and the text to be aligned at the center. And finally, just so that we can actually see these items, let's change the background color a little bit. And so what I'm going to do here is to set it to a white color with only a very, very small alpha. Okay, and so it's basically going to be transparent, meaning that it will be a slightly lighter blue, right? So let's just take a look at that now. And okay, that doesn't look perfect yet. So let's just add some padding here. Okay. So padding 1.5 rem. And in order for this to actually be applied, let's set this to a block. So let's say display block. So how's that going to look? And all right. Now, the thing that I was telling in the beginning that we need here, of course, is the gap. So grid gap to rem. And so it's really great with grid to add spacing. So all we have to do is to use this gap property, and it's really easy to work with this. Because again, this doesn't add any space at the end of the container like margin right would do if we use Flexbox here instead. So like this, it's going to be just perfect. And all right, so we have this nice spacing here going on now on all of them except the last one. And so let's now take a look what happens when we actually decrease the viewport. And oh, you already see that it starts a new column here. Okay, and that's very soon. Oops. So let's actually change that minimum limit here to something a bit smaller. Okay, so it hit these 20 rem pretty soon and went from 6 columns to 5 columns. But if we change that to something smaller, of course, then that limit happens a bit later. And so let's take a look at that. And yeah, so it's happening now. And that's perfectly fine like this. So 3 by 2, and now at some point it will become 3 by 2, yeah, and then just like this in the end. So that's perfect. Okay. Now we of course want these to be like aligned in the vertical direction, and that's very easy to do. By now you're already familiar with this. So align items center. So aligning all of the grid items inside their grid cells along the column axis. So vertically. And here we go. And of course, as we start decreasing, then these here change and automatically align as well. Right? So that part is actually done. Let's just add like some nice hover animation here. So transition all 0.2 seconds. And then let's add this part, this background color here, only when we hover. So on hover and on active. All right, great. I think I also had this effect where I moved it up a little bit. So just a small translate. So again, nothing new here for you. Just to make it a little bit nicer, right? Okay. And now all there's left to do is like the small copyright text here. And so, yeah, let's put that there as well. Here, right after this UL element. So a paragraph with copyright. And so let me write some text here again. So copyright 2017 by Jonas Schmettmann. And that's me, of course. So again, please feel free to use this project for your own purposes. Okay? Now, this does not apply if you plan to produce your own video course or tutorials based on this project. Okay, I'm saying that because unfortunately I actually had people trying to do that. So some people, they take my project and then they do their own video courses with that. And that's not allowed, okay? And so, yeah, just adding that here to make that crystal clear. So let's get this copyright class. And add it down here. So a font size 1.4 rem. And the color that we want here is, let's see, it's this one. So color light 2. Let's add some margin from the top of 6 rem. And text align center. Let's just take a look at that. And all right, that looks quite good already. Now let's actually just make this a bit shorter maybe. So width, let's say 70%. Whoa, what's happening now? Okay, I see that now it's of course not centered here inside this parent element. So we can use the trick where we make the left and the right margin set to auto. So margin right, auto, and margin left, auto, and that is going to fix that. All right, and that's it. So that's a very small footer here. And so we practice some more with CSS Grid, with making this responsive here. So basically without writing the media query, having it adapt to the screen size. And yeah, so we're already getting close to the end here. In the next video, we're just going to finish here the sidebar, and there's actually not a lot to do. It's just adding a small button here, which is actually not doing anything at all. Okay, and then after that, we have just this header and this realtors part here. Okay, so we're getting close to the end, and next up, we have this sidebar here. Let's just take 3 minutes to quickly finish the sidebar of our page. And so once more, you will just apply some of the concepts that you have learned before in the course. So all we're going to do is to add this small button here that we have in the sidebar. And actually when we click it here, then nothing really happens. So this is just a button so that something is in here, okay? So I just didn't want to leave this empty here, and so I just packed this button in there, okay? So in our HTML, right at the beginning, because that's where our sidebar element is, I'm just going to put a button here and call it the nav button. Okay, and no content in there. And then here in the sidebar file, let's quickly style this. So since it's a button, we have to get rid of the border radius and of the border itself. So no border and no border radius. Okay. And so how are we going to do that? Well, once again, we're just going to create like a very small white rectangle here. And then with a before and an after pseudo element, we're going to create the other one. Okay. So this will have a white background color, and it's only going to be 2 pixels high. So 2 pixels and a width of 45 pixels, so 4.5 rem. Okay, and then let's just add the before and the after pseudo elements. So just like this nav button itself, it will have these 3 properties, and in order to make them actually visible, we need to give them the content property. So content, and set it to empty, and I'm also going to display them as a block. Okay, and now finally we have to move one of them up and one down. So the before is the one we're going to move up. So transform, translate in the y direction minus 1.5 rem. And the one after, we're going to move it down. So plus 1.5 rem. So let's take a look at that. And well, that looks kind of weird and not really as expected. So let's take a look at what's happening here with the sidebar and this button here. And so there's not really any style here applying to it. And why is that? So let's see if we have some error, maybe in the terminal here. And actually, yeah, so there's some kind of error. So it's apparently here in this part of the code. And so it's because I have this semicolon inside of these parentheses, and that's not where they should be, of course. Okay, so that's that. And I think we cannot see the one before because it is actually now outside of the page. So we need to move all of this here down a little bit. So the entire button. So margin top, like 4 rem. And let's take a look at that now. And yeah, that looks much better. Now all there's left to do is to really center this here inside of the container. And for that, a good way to do it is to use Flexbox. So remember that I said that Flexbox is great for these very, very small applications like aligning and centering small stuff. Okay, and so that's a perfect use case for using Flexbox. So here on the sidebar container, display flex, and then all we have to do is to say justify content center. Because remember that justify content aligns all of the items along the main axis. And that's the one that we want, so horizontally. And we want to center it, and so that is the result. Now just a small problem here, I see that here this distance here is slightly smaller than this one here, and that's because we translated both 1.5 rem. But the place where it starts counting this offset is not really centered here apparently. And so we just have to move this one here, so the after one a bit up. So probably like 2 pixels. So instead of 1.5, let's give it 1.3, and that fixes it. And okay, so we're good to go. Another component that is ready now. So all that's left to do is to really finish now this header and this realtors part. Welcome to the next part of the project, which is to finally build the header. And so in this lecture, you will learn how to manage vertical spacing in a completely responsive layout using some more advanced CSS grid techniques. And also, you will use the before and after pseudo elements as grid items. So in this header, we have the logo of the company. Then we have this H3 element here, which we already styled before. Then this main text here, which is the H1 element, so the main heading of this entire page. And then just this button that we also already styled before. And then down here we have like this thing, which gives the page some social proof. So basically these four companies here, they talked about this website and this company. And so we're including that on our page here. And that's how many startups actually do it these days. So when you see a modern page of a startup, you usually have like these icons of some websites that wrote an article about them. So let's put all of that in our markup now, so that we can then after that style it. So here in our header, the first thing is the image, and it's called header logo. And the source is also simply called logo. Okay. Then next up, we have this H3 with the heading 3 class, right? And so this one here says your own home. And then we have the H1 with the heading 1 class. We didn't style this one yet, and so we're going to do that next. So it says the ultimate personal freedom. Okay, then the button. View or properties. Next up, we have the text, which says as seen on, right? So basically we have an element just for this, and then an element which is going to contain these four logos. So header seen on, and I'm going to call this one here text. And this one here is the seen on logos. So image, and right now I'm not going to give these here a class, because I think that having these more complex class here is already more than enough, and we can then simply select the img in there. And actually here we're missing the header, and so yeah, that's correct. So img and logo bbc. Okay. Then we have Forbes, TechCrunch, and Business Insider. 2, 3, and 4. All right, let's take a look at that. And here we go. Now, of course, all of this is huge, but we're going to take care of that in a second. Let's start with our H1 element here. And so let's close the footer and the sidebar and open our typography file here, because that's where the heading are. So the heading number 1, we want a font size of 4.5 rem. We want the color to be the color gray light. Okay, so basically almost white. And then also, just as we have here in the H2, we want the line height of 1. Okay, so for a situation when we have 2 lines here in this text, then we don't want all the spacing between these 2 lines. Okay, and that looks much better. And now let's take care of these images here so that we can then lay out this here using a CSS grid. Okay, so it is our header file. And so let's add our selectors here. So logo, the seen on text, the seen on logos, and then remember in there we are going to select the image tags directly. So we don't have a separate class for them here this time. Okay, so these images, they should all have the same height. So let's say 25 pixels. Okay, and we want them to have the same height because that's the way it looks better. So just like this, imagine if we would have them having the same width, then they would have different heights, and that would look weird when they are side by side like this. Okay, now as for the logo, let's give it a height of, let's say, 3 rem. Okay, and so yeah, that looks much better as well. Also, before we move on with the layout part, let's give this here its background image so that it looks just like this here with this house as the background image. And so that's directly on the header element. And so background image. And again, we're going to use this trick where we have multiple backgrounds, where the first one is a linear gradient in order to make the image darker. So I'm going to use RGBA and use the secondary color, so the blue one, and then give it a 93% alpha value. So going from this color basically to the same color. And so that's the best way, again, of creating an overlay for an image. And then after that, of course, img, and this one is called hero.jpg. And this is actually not correct because we need to move out of the CSS folder first before we can go into the img folder. Now just set it to cover here with the background size, and then we should be good to go. Okay, maybe just set it to centered, so the background position to center. And yeah, that looks a lot better. Okay, so now comes the time to create some spacing here between all of these elements, and then also center them both vertically and horizontally here in this header element. So how would we have done that in the old days? So probably we would have just created a container for all of these elements. We would then have centered that container inside of the header, and then we would have just created some margins here, like margin bottoms, on these different elements to create some spacing. But with CSS Grid, we can do better than that. And that's because with the grid, we can define the line heights instead of having to define some margins. And so that's a lot easier, and it makes a lot more sense, I think. And so let's now go do that here for this header element. So display grid, and so we're going to turn this entire header element into a grid container, and then we can define its rows. So template rows. Now, how are we going to do this? Let's take a look again at our final result here. And so we see that there's a lot of space here after this, this logo here, and also a lot of space between this button, in between this element here, which says as seen on. Okay, but let's start here with this space after the logo. So imagine that we wanted to have the logo here on the top, and then push all of these other elements here to the bottom. So how could we do that? Well, we could use the fractional unit. So 1fr. And then simply allow all the other rows to be sized automatically. Okay, so let's take a quick look at how our grid looks like this. Okay, and that's as expected, right? And let's reload this because something here went wrong with the text. But anyway, this looks exactly as expected. So let's actually inspect this new grid that we have here. So this header. Okay, and so this is how our grid looks like. So this here. So all this time we've been using the fractional unit for the columns in order to fill up all the available space that is available, right? But of course, we can do the same with the rows. And it works in this case because the grid container actually has a very well defined height. And that height is this 80% of the viewport height, right? So this entire row that we have here, this first row which contains all of this, remember we defined that as being 80% of the viewport height. So we have here the container. So let me show that to you just to remember. And so here we see. So the first row has 80% of viewport height, okay? And so this entire row here is what that means. And therefore, this header element here also has this 80% viewport height. And so again, this grid container here has a very well defined height, which is 80% of the viewport height. Okay, so if we now come here to this header, and if we hadn't this definition here, then basically all of that space would be divided up equally. But that's not really what we want. Instead, in this very first example, we want this first row to occupy all of their empty space. And so we give it one fractional unit and then allow all the other rows to be sized automatically. Okay? Does that make sense? Now, in order to add some space then here between them, we can of course use the grid gap property. And so that is the big advantage. Instead of having to add some margins to all of these child elements, we can simply do it right on the container, so right on the grid definition. And that's a lot easier than using, for example, something like Flexbox, or even the even older way that I described in the beginning. So grid row gap, and let's set it to 1.5 rem. Okay, and so that's even better than before, but we can do better than that. So let's add some space here after this row here. And so basically what we want here is to increase the row size, right? Because remember, we cannot really style these gaps here individually. And instead, we can increase the row size. So let's set this here like to 6 rem, for example. And so the first row has this fractional unit. Then the second one, we want to be sized according to the content. So let's use min content. And then the next one is 6 rem. Okay, so let's check that out now. And yeah, so you see that now we have this more space here between these two. So that's starting to look more like our original. Now next up, we also want a lot of space here after this button, right? So just like this. And so let's say that we want this row here to be 1FR, such as the row with the logo. Okay, so 6 rem is this one with the text, and then the next one should be 1 fractional unit. And so that's what this is going to look like. Now this is of course not ideal, and it happens because this element always tries to span its entire grid cell, right? So we've been seeing this behavior here a lot of times, and so let's fix that. And we can do that using the align self and justify self properties here on this button. So how are we going to do that? Well, here in our index file, the button is of course this reusable button, and so it doesn't have any class. But right now I think I should give it one, so that I can then apply these two properties that I just mentioned. So justify self and align self. So button and header button as well. So yeah, let's put it here right after the logo. And so what do we want here? We want align self to be start and to be wanted vertically at the top of the grid cell and also horizontally. So justify self and also at the start. So all the way to the left side. And that should fix it. And indeed it does. So this is our grid cell and this is our grid item. Now actually let's give all of this here some padding. Okay, so to move it away here from the sides of the header. And so that's up here. So a padding of 8 rem, let's say. And so that's going to look much nicer. What I just want to change though is that I want to have some less padding here at the top. Okay, so that the logo can be closer to the start of the page. And also I want to center this item here right into its grid cell. And so of course that should be pretty easy as well. So first let's say that we want the padding at the top to be just 4 rem, and then the logo, let's justify self it to center. Okay, and that makes total sense, right? All right. Now if we remove this this overlay grid here, then you will see that it doesn't really look so centered, right? So there's a lot of space going on here on this side. And that is happening because this column here is occupying all the available space. And so let's actually change that. And we're going to do that by saying that we want the column to only have the width of the min content. So template columns and main content. Okay, so we only have one column, of course, and we want it to be just the size that it has to have in order to fit the content. And well, that's not really right. But actually it makes total sense, okay? So remember that main content means that it's the smallest width possible, okay? But actually we don't want main content, we want max content. And so that is the one we're looking for. And yeah, that's much better. And so now it has the size in order to fit the content. And the largest piece of content is this here without having to do any line breaks. So now last thing to do is to then also center this entire grid track inside of the grid container, right? And so we do that by using justify content. Center, of course, and all right, so here we go. That's it. And if we remove now this overlay, then that looks a lot better. So it actually looks quite a lot like this already. Just of course some more things that we have to do and to change, like for example doing this part here at the bottom, but I'm going to do that in the next video so that you can take a break if you want to. In this video, we're going to finish up our website header. So what's left to do here is the as seen on part, so this part here. And in fact, we're going to use two grids for that. The first one is this one here. So what you see here is in fact a small grid, but let's start with the one to lay out these 4 items here. And again, I'm going to use the CSS grid here instead of Flexbox, because I find it so easy to use the column gap instead of having to mess with the right margins or something like that. Okay, so here on the scene on logos, we display this as a grid with 4 equally sized columns. So template, columns, repeat, 4, and then 1 fractional unit for each of them. And then we want a gap between them of 3 rem. So let's check that out. And all right, so that looks much better already. Now let's just center each of them here inside of their grid cell. And so we're going to use justify items, set to center, of course. And now one last thing that I want to do with these images is to make them slightly darker. Okay, so here you have them like in this color, and so it looks like as if they were a bit gray, such as the text here, instead of being this white, which really catches your attention. And we don't want that. And so we can use a filter, and the one I'm looking for is brightness, and I'm going to set it to 70%. So 100% is the default, and if we set it to anything less than 70%, the image gets darker, and if we set it to something above 100%, the image gets lighter, of course. Okay, and so yeah, so that's the change that you just saw here. So that's this part, and now let's talk about the scene on part. And as I mentioned, we're going to use a grid here as well. But probably now you're wondering, well, we don't even have any grid items. How are we going to use a grid here for that? So let's take a look at our HTML. And in fact, this element here, it does only have this text here. So it doesn't even have any child element, which could be a grid item, right? But in fact, that's not correct, because even text can be treated as a grid item. And so if I set this element here to a grid container, then the scene on text here will be one of the grid items. So again, even text can be a grid item. And what can also be grid items are pseudo elements. And so the trick here is to use one before pseudo element and one after pseudo element to create the 2 lines that we see here. So these 2 lines. And so basically this here will be one of the grid items, and the other grid item is this line here, which is a before pseudo element, and this line here is an after pseudo element. And so our 3 grid items will be these 3. Okay, so that's a completely different application of CSS grid, and so I wanted to show you that as well, and that's why I included this small part here in this project. Okay, so we set this here to display grid, And before doing any grid definitions, let's quickly style the text here. So font size 1.6 rem, and the color is the darker light gray. So color gray light and the darker version, so the number 1. Alright, and now let's take care of the before and after pseudo elements. So before and after. And remember that these two here, together with the text, will be the 3 grid items. And as always, we have to define the content property, even if we set it to empty, but without it, this is not going to work. Then we set its height to 1 pixel. We also set it to display as a block. And then we give it a background color. And instead of just copying this color from here, we can use the current color variable, right? Remember this one? So what this does is that it takes the current text color, so the one defined in the color property, and simply uses that one. And so instead of having to write the duplicate color gray light 2 here again, I can use the current color keyword, and that's then going to use this color. And if I change this one, then of course this one changes automatically. And so it's a great addition to CSS, this keyword, this variable. So let's take a look at what happens on the page, and keep in mind that we didn't specify any width here. And so that's probably going to have some effect on that. And all right, it now stretched across the entire container here. And so let's actually take a look at that here. So yeah, so this is our grid. And you see down here that it basically has just one row, but in fact it has more than that, okay, because it also contains these 1 pixel height lines, right? So we can see that here that it actually goes from 1 to 4. So by default, CSS Grid always places its items in rows, right? But instead we want columns. So we want 3 columns, 1 for the line, then after that we want the text here, the scene on text, and then we want the other line. And so let's define our columns. So grid template columns, and the first one is 1fr. So taking the remaining space, then the one in the middle is max content, okay? And let me actually try main content here to show you what happens. And then the last one is 1fr as well. So we want the left and the right side to be the same, occupying all the remaining space, and then the text in the middle. So let's take a look at that. And that's what I meant with the min and max content. So right now this is breaking here into a new line, and that's exactly what min content means. And so what I want here is max content. And so that's what it looks like. Now just 2 more things that we need to add here, which is the space between these columns, so the gap, and then also vertically align these 3 items. So grid column gap, let's say 15 pixels, and then just vertically align these elements. And that should be it. And yeah, that's it. So that's just the same as our initial version, right? Now, of course, the spacing here is different, and that's because we have these dev tools here. And so let's actually see the effect of different viewports on the layout here. Okay, so this is what happens when we change the viewport height. So basically where the space decreases is exactly in the rows where we defined 1fr as the size of the row track. So remember, it's this one here and this one. Let's actually turn that on. So the header. And so now you will start seeing how these rows increase, right? So this one and this one. And that's exactly what I meant in the beginning when I said that we were going to have very dynamic spacing here in the vertical direction in this component. So what CSS Grid allowed us here to do is to add this dynamic spacing here, which changes very easily with the viewport height. And all that because of the power of the fractional unit, right? So that's what allows us to have this behavior where when we change this viewport height, so the height of the container, then this part here stays at the bottom and we want this stays at the top, and all that changes is the size of these rows. Basically this part here stays at the middle. Okay, and so once again we used some advanced tools and concepts here in CSS Grid to achieve exactly what we want. And so with that, you have now the tools to create something similar for your own pages. So of course, I don't want you to do the exact same thing, and that's what I always say, because really I teach you this so that you can have the tools, but not that you can copy exactly what I do here. So always be creative and use these tools for your own layouts and designs. All right, and with that, all there's left to do now is to actually create this missing parse here. So this missing piece, which is the top 3 realtors. And then of course, we're going to make all of this responsive. But for now, as for the layout, all that's missing is this part here. Hi there! This video is about building the realtors section, which is the last part of our project. And so once more, in this video, we are going to apply what we already learned in all the previous lectures. And so this video will actually going to be pretty straightforward. So all we have to do is to put these items here on a grid, and then of course add this small title here. But that should be pretty simple, right? So we will lay out these items here in a 2x3 grid. Okay, so each line for each of these realtors. Now the difference between this section and this one here is that here in the header, we actually declared the entire header element as the grid container, while here in this section, we will have the grid inside of this container as a child element. And that's because we don't want this here as being a part of the grid. Okay, so let's move on here to our realtors element. So we start with our H3 with the heading 3 class and top 3 realtors. So that's the first part, and then we have that element which will be our grid container, and where we're going to have these 2 columns and 3 rows. So I'm calling this one the realtors list, and then in here let's put an image. So image, realtors image, all right, so pretty straightforward. Next up, we have like a div element in which we have the name and also the number of houses sold. Okay, so this here is one grid item, and the other grid item will be all of this here. So this element containing these 2. And then the next grid item will be this, and then this one, and then this image, and then this container. Okay, so this is a div called realtors details. And for the name, we use our H4, heading 4. And remember that we created a light class here, right? So for using a white text color. And so let's do that as well. Heading 4, light. So Eric Feynman. And a paragraph for the number of houses. So 245 houses sold. Okay, now just copy this 2 times. Number 2 and number 3. This lady is called Kim Brown, and she sold 212. And then the last gentleman is called Toby Ramsey with 198 houses sold. Okay, and that's it. That's actually all the markup that we need. So let's open up this file now. And as always, add our selectors. So we have the list, of course the image, and the sold. So let's take a look at that now. And yeah, of course, as always, these huge images look this crazy as always. So let's start by changing this. So width 100%. Also, we want them to be round, so border radius 50%. And it's always best to display images as a block, as we already know. So let's check that out. And yeah, so it's still really huge because we defined 100%. And actually, let's put something else here. So let's put 7 RAM. So basically 70 pixels. And yeah, now that looks much better. Okay, and so now all we have to do is to put these in our grid. And yeah, this time the grid is this list. So display grid, and then let's define our columns. So the first column is for the images, and the second column is for the text. And so the image we already know is 7 RAM, and so all we have to do here is to set it to min content. Okay, so that it fits the image nicely. And then as for the text, let's use max content, so that it doesn't create any line breaks in our text. Check that out. And all right, it's side by side and laid out in this grid now. Let's take a look at that. And all right, so you see it's actually a grid. Now all we need to do is to define some spacing here. So let's add a spacing to the columns and to the rows. So the columns, let's add 20 pixels. And now between the rows, let's add something different here. And this time we're going to use the VH unit again. So I'm going with 5 VH, so 5% of the viewport height. And why did I do it this way? Well, of course, because I wanted this margin, this spacing, to change whenever we change the height of the viewport. And that's because on a really large screen, this starts to look like really ridiculous. So on a very large screen with a huge viewport height, we would have this very small component sitting here in the middle with a lot of space around it. And that looks kind of weird. And so I decided to go with the viewport height unit. And so you see, as we change this, we also decrease the spacing between the rows. Okay, now as for this text, let's format this one here and move it up a little bit. So it's this sole text here, and I want it in uppercase. The color should be the gray light too. So let's get that from here. That's actually already selected. And let's move up a little bit, so just like 3 pixels. So a negative margin to the top does the job quite well here. We could have used a transform, but this here works just as well. Okay, so that looks nice. And now all we have to do is to vertically center this here in the middle. Okay, and we can actually do that here on the container. And of course, that's this one. So let's here say align items center. So centering the items inside the cells vertically. And all right, that's it. Let's just give this entire realtors component here a padding. So padding of 3 rem. And yeah, okay. And now all that's left to do is to actually center all of this here in this parent element, both horizontally and vertically. So let's think about how we can do that. The first option that comes to mind is to use Flexbox, because we've done that a lot of time. But again, I'm going to use grid here. So since this is a grid project, let's then actually use CSS grid in order to center it. And that's really easy, right? All we have to do is to say that this element here should be a grid container, and then align the tracks to the center both horizontally and vertically. So display grid, align content center, and justify content center. And that's it. So just like that, we centered all of this. So let's check out that grid. And so you see, we have a grid with one column and with two rows because we have these two elements. So this heading and this part. Now we just need some space here after this realtors, and we also need to center it here inside of the grid. Okay, so how can we do that? Well, we could just add some spacing directly to this element, so this H3 element. But for that, we would have to use the helper classes that I created earlier. But instead, what we can do is to just define a gap between the rows of this small grid, and then that is going to create the spacing that we want just as fine. So grid row gap, let's say to rem. And there's our spacing. And now if we say justify items set to center, then that will center this element. So let's put that here. Justify items center. Okay, and yeah, that's it. Now why did this last property only affect the title and did nothing with this part here? So it didn't do anything here because this content here is actually what defines the width of the grid. And so centering this here does nothing because this grid cell is already the size of the entire track and the entire grid container. And so centering does nothing to it here in this case. Okay, and that's it. So nicely centered. Also, as we decrease, now we actually have some issues here in this header part, but we're going to fix that together with all of the other things that are not working 100% for the responsive layout right in the next 2 lectures. So now that we have our page completely designed, okay, so we're really ready with all of this, and this is great progress. So we used a ton of grids here to build all of this, but if you want to make this truly responsive, then we have to add a couple of media queries still. So some of the parts are already like responsive like this, but not everything is possible to do without media queries. And so in the next 2 videos, we are going to write some media queries to make this page truly responsive. Okay, so stay tuned and see you in a minute. In this lecture and the next one, we are going to adapt our website to a smaller screens, and so making it truly responsive. And in order to do that, we are going to write a couple of media queries. So I'm now back to Google Chrome, as you can possibly see here, because I like the dev tools for responsive developing much better than the ones in Firefox. And so that's why I'm using Google Chrome here now. But before that, let's actually take a look at the web page here in Google Chrome, and we can verify that actually everything works just the same as in Firefox. Okay, so the grid layout is fully implemented in the current Chrome and Firefox versions. So everything works exactly the same. Okay, so that is the mobile view here in the Chrome DevTools. So just by clicking this icon here, and that brings us this responsive view here that we can then play around with. Now I have to set here to 50%. We can set it maybe to 75. And so let's take a look what happens as we decrease the screen. And the first thing that comes into notice immediately is a problem here on this header, right? So you see that these images here and also the content of the header, they start overlapping everything. And that is because of these images. Okay, so we set them to a fixed height. If I remember it correctly, it was 25 pixels or 2.5 rem. Yeah, so here you see that. And so therefore they cannot really scale. So when we reduce this, then images will stay just the same size. And then this entire grid here, which is defined basically by the size of these images, will also stay the same size. And the same happens for the entire grid container here. And so therefore all of this content then overflows and looks crazy like this. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is to fix that. Okay? And so instead of using height, I'm going to use min height. So let's open the header file here and come down here to the image. So we need to set the max height to 2.5 rem. Now what we also need to specify here is the actual width of this image, because otherwise this is not going to scale properly. Okay, and so we're going to use max width here as well and set this one to 100%. So what max height is going to do is that the height can be 2.5 rem, but it can also be less than that. And the same here for the width. So usually it should be 100%, but of course it can be less. And that's what will happen when the height here gets less than 2.5 rem. Okay, now the problem is that this is actually not all we have to do. So let's take a look at that now. And so you see that it's still not decreasing. So why do you think that happens? And if you think about it, you will come to the conclusion that it is because of the definition that we have here in the header that the column should be the max content, right? So let me show that to you here in the header. And down here, we say that the column should be the max content. And so basically, it should be as wide as possible in order to fit all the content, regardless of the width of the viewport or the container itself. And so what we need to change now is that. So what can we do here? So of course, we're going to use a min-max. So we have done that a couple of times. And the most wide that this column can be is of course this max content. So that's the maximum. But the minimum is min content. Right? So we could have specified like a width here as well, like saying 10 rem or 20 rem or something like that. But instead we say here that the column should never be more narrow than the content. And that should now fix it. And indeed, it does fix it. It creates a couple of other problems, okay? But at least the main problem here is fixed now. Now, one thing is that these here should be vertically aligned. So let's add that. And that is here in the scene on logos, of course, as well. And so here we have to do align content, or actually align items, because we're talking about the individual items inside of each cell. And so that's fixed now as well. And now the only problem that's left is this one here. So remember that for the row here, we specified a fixed height. But now this content here is actually overflowing that height that we defined. So let's take a look at that. And so here we have the header and the grid template rows. So this is the first one for the logo, and this is for the heading that we were talking about. And so it's this 6 rem here that is overflowing. So let's again add a min-max here. And we say that it should at least be 6 rem. Okay, and so that's for a situation where the text doesn't break into a second line, but it can also be min content. Okay, so in order to at least fit the content that we have in the row. And so let's wait, and yeah, that now fixes that issue as well. So if we now resize this, then it works just very nicely, at least for the higher viewport width. For these really small screens here, we then will have to change some more stuff later with media queries, but for now, everything is flexible here in this layout. And with that done, let's now actually start with the media queries themselves. And the technique I'm going to use is again the one where we resize the screen and see where the design breaks, and then that will be where we will approximately set our breakpoints. So if we start doing that here, then we see that here at some point probably we can start to decrease the text size. Okay, so everything starts to look a bit cramped here now. So like at 1200 pixels here. So everything starts to look a bit cramped. There's not much space left here anywhere. And so let's now decrease our overall font size just like we did in the last project. And so that will buy us some more space here. So we want to set the first media query at 1200 pixels. And so what we want to reduce is this font size here to, let's say, 50%, so that instead of 1 rem being 10 pixels, it will be 8 pixels. So how am I going to do that? Well, just like in the last project, again, I'm going to keep it simple and just create a couple of variables, each for one breakpoint, and then use these variables to write the media queries. Okay, so these are our responsive breakpoints. we're going to start with the one called largest. And this one is for 1200 pixels. But remember that we shouldn't really use the media queries with pixels, but instead we are going to use M. And so we divide 1200 pixels by 16, which is the default font size for a browser. And so we end up with 75 M. So just like we did in the last project, nothing new here. And so let's just write down that this one corresponds to 1200 pixels, just to keep it in mind. Okay, so that's done. And so let's now very simply add our media query, only for the screen, and the max width is of course BP largest. Okay, so again, we're going to use max width media queries here. And so we did once more a desktop first layout. And that's just because I find it a lot easier to show you all these features that I showed you with CSS Grid on a large screen, okay, and not on a small screen like a phone. It would be very difficult for me to show you this stuff on a small screen like that. And so instead I'm going with a desktop first layout. But if you're doing a mobile first layout, then everything really works the same. So the styles that you have outside of the media queries are for the small screen, and then you start increasing from there using min width media queries. So just like we learned in one of the other sections of the course. And if you didn't actually watch that, so maybe if you jumped right into this part of the course, then if you're not familiar with that, then please just check out, I think it's section 6 of the course, where you're going to learn all about that. But anyway, let's now move on here. And what we want to do is to, as I said before, reduce the font size to 50%. And again, if you jump to this part of the course without taking the other parts of the course, then maybe this doesn't make much sense. So just to recap, this overall font size here is just so that one rem is 10 pixels, so that we can then use rem throughout all our designs, knowing that one rem is 10 pixels. And the great thing about that is that we can then automatically reduce our entire layout simply by changing this font size. And that's exactly what we did down here. So below 1200 pixels, our font size changes to 50%. And then all of a sudden, one rem becomes 8 pixel, and then everything changes. So everything becomes a bit smaller, right? So let's check that out. And already you saw that it took effect here, I hope. Okay, so that's the initial version, and then at 1200, bam. See, everything got a lot smaller. So that's the first media query. That was a very simple one, just to give us some more space here, and so that we can then set the next media query a bit more below. Okay, so let's move on here a bit. And yeah, so you see that already this here happened, so we changed to a 2-column layout here. So let's go up a little bit again. So for example, here at 1000 pixels, and everything still looks good at this point, right? So no problems anywhere to be found here. Now if we reduce this even more, let's say to 900, just like this, well then it's starting to look not so good anymore. So I think that, for example, here there's not enough space at all. And overall, I think that this sidebar here is no longer really at the right place here. Okay, so for a smaller layout, it doesn't really make much sense to occupy this many space just for the sidebar here, which doesn't have much function anyway. And so here at 1000 pixels, that is when I'm going to change that. So let's take this sidebar and simply put it up here. And what that means is that we actually have to change our grid definition. And that's something where CSS Grid is really strong. So with a simple media query, we can completely change our entire layout simply by changing our grid definitions. Okay, so all we have to do is to now add a new row to this grid and remove this first column. Okay, and so that's what we're going to do now. But first we need to, of course, add a new breakpoint. And so let's divide 1000 by 16, which gives us 62.5 rem. Okay, so this one is called BP large at 62.5 m. Just noting down that this is 1000 pixels. So Let's just copy this one here, come down here, and okay. So now let's copy this. So our entire grid definition. So as I was saying, we have to just add a new row and remove the first column. So the first column is this one here, this 8 rem, and also this line name here. And so now our layout is going to start here at the full start grid line. And for the row, I'm just going to add a new one at the top with 60 pixels high. Well, actually no longer 60 pixels, but 6 times 8, so 48 pixels. Because remember, 1 rem is now 8 pixels at this green width. So that is the grid definition, but then we also have to place the sidebar in the right place, right? So let's open it up. And now this grid row here is no longer correct, and neither is the grid column. So let's add a media query here as well. And I'm going to take this one here and copy it, because I'm kind of lazy and don't like to write the same code over and over again. So I'm just copying it. So the grid column is now no longer sidebar start, sidebar end, but instead we can actually say that it's from the first to the last. So very simple. And as for the grid row, it is from line number 1 to line number 2. And that's actually it. So let's take a look at that. And all right, here we go. So the sidebar is now at the top, so it's no longer really a sidebar. But anyway, it's now at the top here. And our design no longer has this bar here on the side. And it goes all the way from the left side of the screen to the right side. And let's actually see if that changes. Yeah, so it's just below 1000 pixels where it moves up there, right? Now just imagine the nightmare it would have been if we didn't name our column lines. So if we didn't have all of these column names and instead would have placed the items with the line numbers. So now all of these numbers would be completely different because we took out the first column. And so we would have to rewrite all the code to place all of the items on our grid, right? And that would be a terrible experience. And so that's why it's so great to have the possibility of naming the grid lines like this, right? So again, when you have a huge layout like this one, which you also want to change with media queries later on, then please always name your columns. That's always the best thing to do. And if you need to place the elements on the rows, then also name the rows. In this case, we didn't do that because basically our markup follows the logical structure, and so the auto placement algorithm places them just where we want them to be. Now, just one small thing that's not right here is that this icon, I actually want it here to the right side. So let's very quickly change that as well. And so we need to say justify content flex end, because remember we did this using flexbox. And then also say align items set to center. So vertically center the icon inside of the sidebar. Okay. Now we also need to change some stuff here in this button. And that's because we have this margin here, but we don't want that. So margin top 0. And so, yeah, that looks better. Instead, we actually want the margin on the right side. So let's say like 3 rem. And okay, so that looks a lot better. Now we can maybe just decrease here the space that we have there. And so let's quickly do that as well. Let's say this one to 2 and this to 0. Okay, so that looks more natural again. All right, so I think that is enough for now. So I think we're good now for a long time here, actually. So at least here until this 800 pixels, where it starts to look a bit weird in here. But we're going to take care of that right in the next lecture so that we don't end up with like a 30-minute video here. This is part 2 of writing our media queries. And this is where we left off. So remember that the last media query we wrote was for the 1000 pixels here. Okay, so right here. So let's now move down like a lot, for example here to 700, and take a look if everything is still right. But it's really not. Okay, so here you see that the text is already overflowing, and well, down here everything looks okay to me, and here as well. And that's because, remember, we did all of this here automatically without the media queries, and so we're not going to have to worry about neither this section here and also not all of these here. So the problem lies here in this story, and also I see here in the realtors, because there's not really enough space. Okay, and so we need to fix that. And I always like to go here in 100 pixel steps, and so if it's not right at 719, then let's do the media query at 800. Okay, so right here. So that is the last point where it still looks good, or at least acceptable. Okay, and so from here on we will then change stuff. And how are we going to do that? Well, the first thing is to put this realtors here actually below the header. So we will have the header expand all the way from the first column to the last one, and the realtors here as well. And so we will put that one here down below, and then put these realtors here, all of them side by side, and get rid of that text here. Okay, and the same thing here as well. So we're going to put this text part here first, and then the images below. Okay, but let's start with this top part here. So again, we start with the variable definition. So breakpoint, and this one is medium. And so let's calculate 800 by 16 makes 15 m. So 15 m, and that is 800 pixels. Okay, and so of course the first thing that we have to change is our grid definition. Right, because right now we are going to have a new row. And the column here we actually don't need as well, but what we want here is the new row. And that's right after the header, right? So this first row is for the sidebar, the second one here will be for the header, and then the one after that will be a new one, and that's for the realtors. Okay, and so that's it. So we want it to be the size to fit the content, just as we have here in all of these others. Now beside that, what I also want is this header to actually fill up the entire viewport. Okay, so let's do that by saying 100 view age. Okay, but that will actually not be 100% correct, but let's actually take a look at why that is. So the positioning here didn't change yet because we didn't change that, but we see that the row here changed to 100 viewports, right? But the thing is that actually it has some more space down here. So you see that when I scroll down, I want it to end basically at this point so that the next section starts right after the header. But you see that it actually continues here. And that's because of these 6 RAM here that we have here at the top, right? So we said that this row here has 100 viewport heights, and in fact it has. So when we scroll like to this point, then you see it fills the entire area. What we didn't account for was this 6 RAM here. And so let's do that, and we can do that using the calc function. And so the calc function is really amazing. It's really helpful. And I showed you some applications of this earlier in the course, but here again, it is really useful. And so you can also see now that we can actually use the calc function here in the grid definitions. Okay, and so what we do now is to basically take 100 viewport heights and then subtract these 6 RAM that we have here for the sidebar. Okay, and so that's going to do the trick. And so you will see now that once we start scrolling, that the next section will appear right below that. Right? So just like this. That's exactly what we want. Now, next up, let's then finally position these 2 grid items here where we want them to be. And remember, we want both of them to span the entire viewport. So that's right here in the header. And so let me get that media query here again. And yeah, I can do it right here. And so what's going to change is this grid column here, right? So right now we will have grid column from 1 to -1. And that's it. I could also have used full start to full end, but it's really just the same. So it doesn't really matter. Now, next up, we have to do the same thing for the realtors. So let's come here and put the same media query in here. And now taking a look, and you see that it's already working. Okay, so now both the header and the realtors span the entire viewport. But you see that this is here now occupying way too much space, and we actually do have space to put all of this side by side. And so let's do that now. So where is that? Yeah, it's here. It's this list, right? So that is our other grid that we have here. And so remember that our grid template columns here was min content and max content. And so let's change that now. And what we want here is to actually have this here 3 times. So we will have an image and then the text, and then again an image, and then again a text, and then again the image, and then again the text. So it will be min content and max content, but 3 times. So repeat 3 times all of this. And so you see here that we can put actually more than 1 track here in this repeat function, right? So we can put as many tracks as we want here, and they will then be multiplied. And so we will end up with 6 column tracks here instead of the 2 that we started with. Okay, that should already be enough. And yeah, that looks great. So that part is solved. And so let's move on to this one here. Okay, and so the solution here will be, as I mentioned before, to put this part here, so the content part here on top, and then this part with the images here below. Okay, and both spanning, of course, the entire viewport as well. So let's implement that very quick. And so actually we just have to copy this media query here to, where is it? Yeah, here's the story. So the pictures part will span from 1 to -1, overriding what we have here. And then of course the same for the content, right? So overriding then effectively this part of the code. Okay, let's check it out. And yeah, so that doesn't look like perfect, but it's for now, it's okay like this. What we want to change now though is that this part here should come first. And so for that, we are now gonna actively place this item here on the row that we want it to be. So what row line does this one start? So now here in this DevTools, we don't have the row lines, but we can count them manually, okay? So up here is number 1, then row line number 2, number 3, 4, and 5. So we want the content to start at 5 and go to 6. Okay, so grid row 5 to 6. Let's check it out. And yeah, indeed, that's it. Now all we have to change is the placement here of these images, of course. So let's do that. And so I'm going to paste the media query here. And so how are we going to do that? So remember that we have a 6 by 6 grid. And so let's put this image here starting on grid column number 1 to, let's say, grid column number 3. And then the rows, let's start it from the start and all the way to the end. Okay, and then actually let's add a padding here to these pictures. Of 3 rem. And the same here. So basically we now want these images here to go from the start all the way to the beginning of the grid. Okay, and here I'm just going to leave the column, but I also want the width to not be 115%. So let's say width 100% instead. And let's just take a look at that. And okay, that doesn't look perfect yet. So let's maybe increase the size of this one here, and then also make it actually occupy the entire grid area here. So I want a height of 100% here now. And let's then change the width automatically. So auto. Okay, and here let's say column number 4. So how is that going to look like? And actually not much different. Let's change the padding here. And you see that this is all very subjective, so you could do it in any different way. I'm just adapting it here so that it looks better in the end. And that's actually still not looking all too good. So let's try to increase this here even further. And what I also actually noticed is that we have something missing here, which is the background size. So we want the background size of cover here, of course. So that changed now, but here with this image, nothing really changed. Let's inspect that. And so that's kind of weird. Let's change the width to 100% so that it actually fills the cell that we just defined. And yeah, so that looks much better. Okay, so the width that we want is 100% so that it actually occupies the entire grid cell in width. So the width should still be 100%. So that's the same that we have up there. So let's actually get rid of this and of this as well. And yeah, so that should fix it. If we reload it, and yeah, so that looks much nicer. And so yeah, this is fixed as well now. Right? Looks really great. Well, not at this point here again, but again, we will have to fix that later in another media query. But for now, it works fine like that. So our entire page looks amazing at this point of 800 and even 700 pixels like this. So where should we then place our next media query? And everything looks great here at this point, I believe. So everything is fine. Well, not really here. Okay, and I think we actually should have fixed that in the other media query. So in this one here. So in the 800 pixel one. So this one. And so let's try to fix that now. And the problem is here in the grid definition again. So we have this 4D viewport width here that applies to this row here. Okay? Because it's the 1, 2, 3, 4, the 5th row. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But we actually no longer want this to happen. Instead, we want the content to dictate the size of the row. And so therefore, let's change this to min content. And actually, we didn't even add a new row here for this, right? So we simply placed this grid item here in this new row, but we didn't create a new one. And that's not a problem because all that's going to happen is that these rows are placed on an implicit grid. So what we want to do here is to change this to main content. And so we have a lot of main content here. And so in fact, we can actually get rid of all of this. Okay, because as I was mentioning, the automatic placement algorithm will take care of that. We don't have to worry about it. So the only two rows that we really want to style in terms of size by ourselves are the first two. So the sidebar and the header. And the rest will now be sized based on the content. Okay, and so if we now decrease this, then you see that everything is fine with this section. And so is this with this one here. Okay, and so all we really have to change here for the smaller screens is this part here. So at this smaller width, like 500 or 550, it starts overflowing. Okay, and so that's not what we want. And so we need to fix that. And I'm going to do that here on 600 pixels. And also I'm going to decrease the padding on this section. All right. So at 600 pixels, these two things are all we have to change because again, the rest here now works perfectly fine. Right? So let's add a new variable here. BP small, and 600 by 16 is 37.5 M. Which means 600 pixels. So the first issue is in the header. And so let's copy this actually. And so all we're gonna change here is the padding to 5 rem. So going from 8 to 5 rem. And then the next thing is in the realtors. So up here. And what we want to happen now is to basically go back to what we had here in the beginning. So put these realtors one after the other, so one below each other. So all we have to do now is to go back to this grid columns, put it here, and then we should be good to go. Well, actually, nothing really happened, I believe. Let's reload. And maybe there's something wrong with the media query here. So BP small. But actually, everything seems to be correct. Let's check out if there's any error maybe here in the terminal. And yeah, so again, of course, there is something. And yeah, so it's this semicolon. So I'll give it a save again. And yeah, so here we go. One after the other now again. And here we have the smaller padding, which looks a lot better now. Okay, and so this now works even on like really small screens like this, right? Now this is maybe not really perfect, so you could like decrease the spacing here in this section, decrease this spacing here, and all of the spacing maybe here in this grid. But I'm not going to do all of that. All I wanted to really do is to make the layout look good. And that's actually happening, so everything is perfect. And you saw how little CSS media queries I actually had to write in order to make the layout go all the way from this fully fledged web page to a mobile screen like this. So we only wrote maybe 100 lines of media queries, or maybe even less, to achieve this. And that's all because of the power of CSS Grid. I really can't stress that enough. So if you want to go ahead and make this even better and practice your media query skills here, then please do that. But I believe that for now, this is more than enough. Okay? So great work, great progress up until this point, and our website is now basically ready. In the next two videos, we will just discuss a couple of more theoretical stuff. But as for the coding, it is actually now pretty much done. So great work, and yeah, see you next time. So with CSS Grid being a relatively new and modern technology, of course we need to talk about browser support before finishing up this section. And so that's what we're going to do in this video. And let's start by looking at the grid support here at caniuse.com. So that's always a reference for checking which CSS features are available on which browsers. And so you see that actually the support for CSS Grid is fairly good. So like 77% of the global users do right now support CSS Grid. And we can also see that all modern browsers as of today support Grid. So the current version of Edge, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, and iOS Safari. And also Chrome for Android here on Samsung Internet. So the stock browser of the Samsung phones. Now the problems here are, as always, the older Internet Explorers and also Microsoft Edge. So the old Internet Explorer has a very old specification of Grid, which is not really usable. So we actually don't even prefix the Grid properties for the older Internet Explorers because it's not even worth it, okay? So based on this scenario, of course the question is, as always, can I use CSS Grid in production today? And by today, I mean by the end of 2017, when I'm recording this video, or even sometime in 2018. Now, if you're watching this in the far future, then you probably don't have to worry about any of this. But right now, in this year and the next year, we will have to think about this. Okay? And as always, the answer depends on a lot of factors. For example, if you know that your audience are mostly high-tech users, which will most likely all use the modern browsers, then probably using CSS Grid is no problem. But if you know that it's the other way around, so if you can guess that your audience are not so technical people and that many of them maybe haven't updated from an old Internet Explorer or even from an old Safari here, which also doesn't support Grid, then in that case, maybe it's not so safe to use it in production right now. At least not without having a fallback. Okay? And speaking about fallbacks, that brings us to something called progressive enhancement. And I think I've talked about this before in the course, and so let's talk about it again here in the case of CSS Grid. So basically with progressive enhancement, we build a page with the older CSS methods, pretending that new stuff like Flexbox and Grid doesn't even exist. And then on top of that, we build our layout with CSS Grid if the browser supports it. Okay? Now I'm actually not a huge fan of doing that, because that means that we have duplicate work and that we still have to mess around with all this old code. And if we decide to write our code with the older methods like float layouts and all that, then we might as well leave it like that and not use any CSS Grid at all. But anyway, I'm going to show you how we could theoretically go about doing that. So in case you want to use progressive enhancement with CSS Grid, I'm going to show you how you can do it. So I'm going to use just a small example of our page, which is this section here. So basically laying out these 6 items here in the 3x2 grid. All right, so let's come here to our code editor again and open up the features file. And so what takes care here of aligning the elements in the 3x2 grid is this part here of the code. So let's just pretend it doesn't exist for now. So let's pretend we cannot use CSS Grid. And then this is what it would look like. Okay, so without CSS Grid enabled in a browser, this is what it would look like. And actually a bit worse even, because we also use CSS Grid for each of these items. So we would have to deactivate it here as well. And so yeah, that's what it would look like completely without CSS Grid. Okay, but anyway, let's now try to lay out these items like we had them before. So in this grid here like this. So how could we do that? Well, we would actually have to use floats on each of the feature. So let's come here and write float left. So let's take a look at that. And that's actually not doing anything because we have to give them a width. So these block elements, they're now occupying 100% of the available width. And so if we give each of them like 1/3, so 33.3333%, then that should probably look like what we want. Okay, now let's just give it some margin here at the bottom. 6 rem, and then some padding to each of them as well. And whoa, that actually looks not like we want it to look. So let's just get rid here of the padding. Okay, and so yeah, that kind of looks like what we had before. So I'm not doing this in a perfect way, I know, but it's just to show you how we could do it with progressive enhancement. So how can we now add the CSS Grid stuff on top of this? Well, just as I showed you before, we can use the supports add rule. Okay, and so I can write add support and test if the browser supports display grid. And if it does so, then we want this code here to execute. Right? Does that make sense? But that's actually not all that we have to do in case that the browser supports grid, right? Because right now we also have this code here active. And so that would look like this. Okay, so that's also not what we want. And so let's put the feature query here as well. Add supports, display grid, and then let's basically reset these properties. Now we don't have to do it for all of them because certain things are actually ignored by grid containers and grid items. And the same applies to flex containers and flex items. So what gets ignored by CSS Grid and Flexbox are floats, display inline block, display table cell, and vertical align altogether. Okay, so this float here, we don't have to reset it because it's actually ignored now that this feature here is a grid item. So all we have to do is to reset this width here, set it to auto, and the margin bottom, we also need to get rid of that. So 0. And here we go. So we're back to normal. And if we had a browser now which wouldn't support grid, then it would simply display it the way as we had it before. So basically without this code and without this code. All right, so you could now go ahead and build the entire page like this using the older methods basically as a fallback. And that would mean, of course, that you would have a lot of duplicate work, and also the website would look different on different browsers. But that's not really a problem. The problem here is all the duplicate work, and again, that's why I'm not really a fan of doing it like this. So just to wrap up, in conclusion, it really depends on your audience if you can use CSS Grid today in production or not. I think that personally, I'm gonna go all in with CSS Grid next year when I'm redesigning my personal website. Okay, but that's again because I think that most of the visitors, so people like you taking my course, are more technical users. And so I think that people like you use all the modern browsers, and so I'm pretty sure that I'm not leaving out many people if I'm using CSS Grid. Okay, and with that being said, we are now done with our project. In the next lecture, we will just have some final considerations and then really wrap up this section and this project. Welcome to the last video of this section. It's now time for some final considerations. And the first thing that we can do is to actually run or build a script that we have here. So remember that we have this build CSS script here, which will compile, prefix, and compress our code. So let's do that. And so I'm opening a new tab here and running npm run build CSS. And so here we go. So it's now done doing all its work. So let's check it out. So this one is the prefixed style. And so as we scroll down here, you will immediately notice that there aren't any prefixes on the CSS Grid properties. And that's because the only prefixes that ever existed for CSS Grid are from a very old version of the specification in one of the very old Internet Explorers. And so that's not really useful at all these days, and that's why the auto prefixer turns off prefixes for grid by default. Okay, so they're not really necessary, they're not adding any meaning here. Okay, and so what we have here is just the normal compiled CSS, where some things have the prefixes, but not really the CSS Grid properties. Okay, and then of course, our final CSS is this beautiful thing here. Okay. Next, another thing that I wanted to mention in this video is that there's actually a shorthand for defining these template rows and columns in a grid. So if you someday encounter something like this, so grid template, then that means that you're seeing the shorthand property. Okay, and it works like this. So we have the rows, then the slash, and then the columns. I believe at least, because I'm never really using the shorthand, because I find it quite confusing to have all of this code here in the same line of CSS. Okay, but anyway, let's deactivate these two rows and take a look. And whoa, what's going on here? And so I guess it is actually the other way around. So first the columns and then the rows. Let's take a look at that now. And it still looks the same. So I'm not really sure what's going on here. Let's move it back. So rows again first and columns. And let's take a look at that again. Let's inspect all of this container. And it says here for some reason that it's an invalid property value. So I'm not really sure why that is. So let me try it somewhere else. Okay, so somewhere less, where there's a less complex grid. So for example here, well, this one doesn't really have rows. So let's try it here in the gallery. Okay. So grid template. And so first the rows. And then the columns. Give it a save. And let's check it out. And yeah, so this time it actually works. But in fact, the property is not really here. Let's reload this. And what's going on here? Ah, okay, I forgot the semicolon. Ah, yeah, so finally, now it's working. So here's the grid template. First the rows, then the columns, and then here we go. So now it's working. And so, yeah, so if you someday stumble across this syntax here, then just know that this is the exact same way as having the rows with this part here and the columns with this part. Okay, so that's just something else that I wanted to mention here. And something else that I wanted to mention is that there are some things that I think are missing in grids. And I believe we already talked about most of them. And the first thing is CSS subgrids. So subgrids is something where the grid inside a grid can snap the tracks to the parent container, so to the parent grid. And that would be something really helpful, and I believe that it's actually coming to grid sometime in the future. Also, it would be great if we could change individual gaps. So for example, if we could specify that between line 2 and 3, we wanted to have a different gap than the rest of the rows or the columns. And the third and last thing that I think is missing is a selector where we can select the nth row and the nth column. So for example, if we want to say that we want just to select the second column or the second row of a grid, or all the even rows or all the odd columns, something like this, if we wanted to do something like this, we couldn't really do it with CSS because these selectors right now do not exist. So these things are what I think are missing from CSS Grid right now. And if someday something really important happens or changes in CSS Grid, then of course I will make sure to upload a new video explaining what changed and give you some example of that. So please rest assured that this course and this section will always be kept updated by me in case that anything important happens and changes. Okay? And with this, I think we're really done with this section and with this project. And I hope that you love CSS Grid as much as I do it. I will personally start using it more and more in my projects, and I hope that I was able to teach you and to show you how all of this works, and that I could help you to become a bit better at CSS front-end web development. Alright, and that's it. Have a nice day and see you next time.